And so we begin our story of equality with ancient history, which begs the question, why? After all, there was never any ancient Greek or ancient Roman anything on American soil, so why even include them in the story of American ideas? While this is indeed true, we need to go over ancient classical history because this is the worldview of the founding generation of Americans, those who fought in the American Revolution and those who were around during the framing of the Constitution. Moreover, from the period of American founding to well into the 20th century, you have educated Americans, that is, Americans who are politically organizing the nation, constantly referring back to ancient statesmen of Greek or Roman origin. In fact, many of the ideas which influence American culture do derive from antiquity. The worldview of the American founders, their imagination that is, was steeped in the histories of Greece and Rome. Thomas Jefferson compared the Native Americans to the European peoples before they were incorporated into the Roman Empire. He wrote that they were equal, quote, in their present state with the Europeans north of the Alps, when the Roman arms and arts first crossed over those mountains. He also wrote that he found that, quote, the Indian then to be in body and mind equal to the white man. The American founders considered the statesmen of Rome to be their intellectual forerunners, their ancestors to republican government. The problem of the founding generation of Americans was that they believed the monarchies of Europe prevented republican government, representative government, from actually taking root. And they believed the American wilderness, American soil, was a place in which republican ideologies, venerated for thousands of years, could finally be put into practice, because they were aware that they were creating a nation from scratch. And so they looked into classical history for the best ingredients of what they believed would produce a strong, stable, and expansive nation. In fact, one of the American founding fathers considers the revolutionary generation of Americans to be equal to the freedom lovers of Greece and Rome. John Adams, after the Stamp Act, wrote, quote, to many of them, the historians, orators, poets, and philosophers of Greece and Rome were quite familiar, and some of them have left libraries that are still in being, consisting chiefly of volumes in which the wisdom of the most enlightened ages and nations is deposited. For Adams, America was the only area in the world in which the classical traditions of liberty were pure, in his mind, uncorrupted by the stain of monarchy, aristocracy, and feudalism. The conflict with Britain during the Revolutionary period and the framing of the Constitution only served to highlight this ancient tradition of legacy in the minds of the founders. On the eve of the American Revolution, Samuel Adams in 1774 proudly boasted of his fellow Americans. He wrote that, quote, I think our countrymen discovered the spirit of Rome or Sparta. In the midst of the American Revolution, John Adams wrote to the other American founder, George Washington, quote, you and I, my dear friend, have been sent into life at a time when the greatest lawgivers of antiquity would have wished to have lived. A year later, George Washington replied to a request from the British Army's request to surrender. He wrote that, quote, the associated armies in America act from the noblest motives, liberty. The same principles actuated the arms of Rome in the days of her glory, and the same object was the reward of Roman valor. Indeed, this classical heritage was embodied in one of the greatest rallying cries of the American Revolution, the motto of give me liberty or give me death. However, probably the most obvious manifestation of this classical heritage are in the seals of the United States of America, particularly in the Latin motto, Annuit Cœptis. Annuit Cœptis derives from Virgil's Aeneid. Written 2,000 years ago, the Aeneid is an epic poem that tells the story of Aeneas. Aeneas was a Trojan who fled the Trojan War. He traveled around the Mediterranean and eventually settled in Italy, where he becomes the ancestor to the Romans and Roman Empire. Aeneas has a son named Ascanius. According to Greek and Roman mythology, after the Trojan War, as the city of Troy burned, Aeneas escaped to Latium in Italy. He took his father and his child Ascanius with him. As newcomers in a new land, they blended in to the local society, perhaps a little bit too well. It turns out that there was this magnificent and beautiful woman named Lavinia. Now, it was arranged that Lavinia was to marry Turnus, the king of the Rutuli people. Upon Aeneas' arrival, however, Lavinia is promised to a Trojan prince. Furious at this turn of events, Turnus eventually attacks the Trojan settlers. Amongst the Rutulians was Numanus Remulus, the brother-in-law of King Turnus. Numanus besieged the Trojan settlement with his army. According to Virgil, Numanus marched ahead of the front rank, shouting words that were fitting and unfitting to repeat, his heart swollen with new-won royalty and boasting loudly of his greatness. Twice conquered Trojans, aren't you? Ashamed to be besieged and shut behind ramparts again? Fending off death with walls? Behold, these are the men who demand our brides through war. What god, what madness has driven you to Italy? Numanus then continued to boast about how he came from hardy people, of his beneficent, his superior ancestry. Numanus at the same time points out how the Trojan people come from weak people, how they are unfit to settle and marry the native Italians. It's at this point that the son of the Trojan refugee, Aeneas, steps up. This is Ascanius' moment. This was Ascanius' first experience with combat and war. He was not deterred by death, as his people needed him. After all, his family had fled the Greeks in the Trojan War, and he was determined that his family would not flee again. It's at this moment that Ascanius offers a prayer to Jupiter. Jupiter omnipotens archibus am Coeptis. This loosely translates into all-powerful Jupiter, favor my bold undertaking. And according to Virgil, the father heard and thundered on the left from a clear sky. The taut arrow sped onwards with a dreadful hiss, and passed through Remulus's brow, and split the hollow temples with its steel. This was the precise moment that the designer of the American seal, Charles Thomas, wanted to represent the United States. After all, at its founding, the Americans knew that they descended from immigrants and refugees. They knew that their families had fled violence in the old world in Europe and sought a peaceful and better life in a new continent. But there is more to it than that. According to legend, ancient 2,000-year-old legends, Ascanius was the founder and king of Alba Longa. Ascanius would found a royal dynasty which would eventually include Romulus and Remus. Romulus and Remus being the founders of the city of Rome and therefore the Roman Empire. It was this legacy of a new beginning, of the seeds of a new empire, of a new era, which is also reflected in the American seal and American motto, particularly Novus Ordo Seclorum, which roughly translates to a new order for the ages. And just as how Trojan refugees laid the seeds for what eventually became a Roman Empire, so too with the American founding. They hoped, at the time of the seal's designing, would also lay the foundation for a new America,